We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Hello. Happy Friday afternoon. At least that's where it is, where I am. Happy whatever it is where you are. This is not an official Orbit at a Tilt episode, which is why I am streaming from my personal page instead of from Adam Tilted TV. Excuse me. But I've rearranged some stuff in my office. I have set up my equipment a little bit differently, and I thought it would be a good time to come on and do some testing and tell you about some changes that are coming to Orbit at a Tilt. Also, a good time to remind you to follow Adam Tilted TV so that you get notifications when I go live from there. Okay, so hold on. I have a new... Hi, Alfredo. Thanks for stopping in. Okay, I'm going to put you right where I want you, then I'm going to make you go away. Alright, so I've got a new little frame thing here I'm trying out as well, so let me know what you think about that. I'm going to talk about the Space Force. Really? Already? Ooh, giraffes. I love those. Giraffes are my mom's favorite. Gita. Did I say that right? Gita. As you have probably heard, Donald Trump has, I guess, officially declared that the United States will have a Space Force. And, of course, people are, reacting in a lot of different ways, let's just say. And I have a slightly different opinion. And for one thing, I want to remove it from Donald Trump. And I just want to think of it as an idea. Do we need a Space Force? And I've looked in... Let's talk about the history of the military in the United States. How we got to have the military we have. And then see if a Space Force makes sense. Hi, Pam. So, quick history of the military. When the United States was formed with the Constitution back in 1776 and to 1780, whatever, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps were part of the original armed forces, which were called the War Department at that time. Also, hey, give me a check on volume. Like, give me a thumbs up or let me know you can hear me or something. Because I don't have a good sense of that. Great. All right. So, the Army, the Navy, and the military were part of the War Department, which eventually became the Department of Defense. The Air Force was not established as its own department of the military until 1947, which I didn't forget, Gita. That's what I'm talking about. I'm getting that to the Air Force here. Oh, by the way, I hope you're enjoying some coffee or whatever. I'm having some coffee because I just got up from a nap a little while ago. That's why I got the poopy hair. It's poopy nap hair. All right, so the Air Force was established in 1947, way after avionics were being used in the military. there were planes and lighter than air aircraft, being used in military operations as far back as 1909. World War I and World War II had already come and gone before the Air Force was ever created. Before the establishment of the Air Force, military avionics were under the purview of the Army and the Navy and the Marines. They each had their own, avionics divisions. That was eventually kind of combined into a joint force. And then it was determined that there was enough need for a separate military division that was devoted to air, and that was the Air Force. And the mission of the Air Force is to fly, fight, and win in air, space, and cyberspace. Okay? So the mission of the Air Force already includes space and cyberspace, which I didn't know that until I started researching for this. Just like before the establishment of the Air Force, the mission of the Navy and the Army and the Marine Corps would have... I'm talking about the United States of America. I did mention that at the beginning, but I should repeat that for people who have joined. I'm talking about the United States. So before the establishment of the United States Air Force, the mission to, defend and win in the skies was part of the mission of the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. Space wasn't a concept. But now that it is, it's part of the mission of the Air Force. And the question becomes, is it too much for the Air Force to handle? Is there enough of a need for a military presence in space, protecting or access to space, for it to have its own separate division of the military? It's not a ridiculous concept. This idea has been around for a long time. You probably remember Ronald Reagan talking about it in the 80s, and he was much ridiculed for that as well. But if you think about it, a lot of our assets are in orbit. China has already demonstrated its ability to destroy one of its own satellites with a missile, which means that it could destroy one of our satellites with a missile. And we are becoming more and more dependent on satellites for our economy, our telecommunications. All of those things are part of our national security. So it's not an unreasonable question, because as that becomes more of I don't want to say burden, but more of a potential weak point in our defense, do we need an organization that is devoted just to that, just to space? At this time, I'm not sure, but I don't think it's a terrible idea. I think a lot of people, when they think Space Force, when they hear that term, they think of building, like X-Wings and TIE Fighters and the Starship Enterprise, and that's not necessarily a Space Force. Even just being able to control our own access to space is important to our national security, which brings me to NASA. So how does NASA fit into all this? NASA has a slightly different mission. NASA's mission is to drive advances in science, technology, aeronautics, and space exploration to enhance knowledge, education, innovation, economic vitality, and stewardship of Earth. So NASA is a research organization in theory, although we all know that the Air Force contracts with NASA. So NASA and the Air Force work very closely together. That's how we get our military satellites up into orbit. And don't forget that NASA stands for National Aeronautics Space Administration. So NASA is also doing research in aeronautics, meaning airplanes and suborbital flights, that kind of thing. So we're not just talking about spaceships and satellites and space stations. So I think it's a question that shouldn't be dismissed out of hand just because Donald Trump made the suggestion. He's not the first one to do it. Personally, I think it would be an interesting time to start researching it. I think it's too early to just say, okay, we're going to have a Space Force. We're going to break off part of... Exactly, Gita, who's funding this. See, in my opinion, if we need a Space Force, then that means that the mission of the other agencies, their burden should be lower because the Space Force is covering them from that space, right? I know it doesn't work that way, but that's how I think it should work. I would prefer, if this is going to sound terrible, but unfortunately, we know the world we live in. If we're going to waste money, I say that meaning if we're going to spend money on researching new technologies for military applications that may or may not be used because they may or may not be effective and they may just, be billions of dollars over budget and not work, I would prefer that innovation take place in the area of space, rather, or at least aeronautics, and not on ground equipment, because I don't think that's necessarily where the innovation needs to happen right now. I'm not an expert on the military though, so I'm just talking off the top of my head. But of course, all of this would be funded by the U.S. taxpayer as part of the budget of the Department of Defense. So that would take acts of Congress to approve that kind of budget. So by Donald Trump enacting a Space Force declaration or whatever, nothing's actually happened yet, but the idea is out there. Sort of like when Ronald Reagan suggested his Star Wars thing. Same idea. It does present an interesting challenge for NASA, though, because now, if you think about these, we're talking about space now. You're talking, I'm sure it takes a long time and a ton of money to build an aircraft carrier, but think about trying to build something like that in space. You can just multiply everything by factor of 10, right? So I just wonder. So the problem with NASA is that it takes all this time, but their leadership is constantly changing, constantly. Every time there's a new president elected, their mission stays the same, but their missions change. And it's got to be incredibly frustrating. Before George Bush, that was Bill Clinton? Yeah, gosh, I'm so old. The NASA was working on going to Mars. George Bush then said, no, let's go back to the moon. Right. And then Barack Obama said, no, let's go to an asteroid. And now President Trump has said, no, let's go to the moon. Well, it takes like 20 years to plan and engineer and build one of these spacecraft to go anywhere. Right? So, but you start working on your plan to send people to the moon, and then your orders say, okay, no, we're not going to go back to the moon. We're going to go to Mars instead. Okay, well, that's a whole different ball game. So now we kind of got to start over. So now we've kind of set all that aside. We're going to reuse what we can, but it wasn't designed for that in the first place. So it's going to cost more money down the road when we try to patch it all together, right? And so we're doing the best we can with that. And then there's a new election and new politics. There's new priorities. New senators want, jobs in their state, and their state builds parts for this rocket, and so that rocket will go to an asteroid, but not the moon. And so now we're going to go to an asteroid. And so then, 8 years later, nope, we're going to go to the moon. I mean, if I worked at NASA, I would just be yanking my hair out saying, make up your minds, people. Where do you want us to go? And they're given just like, it's just such a tiny bit of money relative to everything else. So NASA has gotten very good at maximizing the amount of science they can get out of every single mission, because they don't, they can't count on this is how messed up it is. There is a rover on, well, there's several rovers on Mars right now, but the Curiosity rover, it's finished its original mission, okay? But it still works. It's still working. It's working great. It's doing great science. It had some problems, but they're able to work around it, and so that we have a working rover on Mars. Now, you have to have people drive the rover. You have to have scientists that are like telling where to point. So people need to get paid to operate the rover. But the bulk of the money's been spent. You've already gotten the rover. You built the rover. You sent it to Mars. You landed it. It's there. It just seems like that's a dumb way to try to save money, is to say, okay, let's start something brand new. When I said tiny amount of money, Brian, that's funny. When I say tiny amount of money, Geeta, I'm comparing that to the size of the budget as a whole. So NASA gets less than 0.1% of the national budget. So, I mean, it's just like a tiny, if you look at a thing, it's a tiny sliver. The big things in the national budget are the Department of Defense and Social Security, Medicaid, that thing, and the third one escapes me right now. But anyway, it's not NASA. But I got on a tangent. So, Space Force, not a ridiculous idea. It's not. It may be a little ahead of its time. Maybe too soon. But it's not ridiculous. Let's see. The long range, I want to see who this is. Okay, because I'm ready for some comments here. Long range mission for a project like Space Force is a bit lofty to me. That's a good point. And we haven't been given a lot of details about what the long range mission is, or what is the project, right? As far as I know. If you have more details, let me know. I haven't seen anything really detailed, just kind of a general statement. But I could see beginning with making an effort to clear up the space junk, because that's going to be a problem when we start to try to maximize the economic benefits of low Earth orbit. In particular, we're having a storm here, so the lights might flicker out and the power might go. So if I disappear suddenly, that's why. that space junk is going to be a problem. Everything needs to have a reason, but not every reason has to be related to cost benefit analysis in terms of money return on investment. I believe that it's in a country's best interest to invest in these kinds of innovations just to be able to keep up with the rest of the world. But that's aside the point. From a military standpoint, we need to be thinking about what we're going to do about the ability that other countries have to shoot down our satellites. And is a Space Force the way to do it? Could be the start of something. Right now, there actually is. I meant to say this a lot earlier when people were actually listening. Some of you are listening. Hey, I don't know. Maybe. There is a U.S. Space Command. That's part of the Air Force. So basically what is being proposed here is promoting the U.S. Space Command to its own division of the armed forces. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't think anything's going to happen, but if it does, it'll be interesting to see. All right. A couple of changes in Orbit at a Tilt. First off, make sure that you go to Adam Tilted TV and like and follow the page. Turn on notifications, because most of the time when I go live from over there, not from my profile page like I'm doing today. Orbit at a Tilt has normally been on Tuesday mornings, but I realized to my great dismay that I am competing with Bob Herzog and Taco Tuesday. He does his live Taco Tuesdays at the same time that I was doing Orbit at a Tilt. And that's just not acceptable. There's not room enough in that time slot for both of us. And I bow to Bob Herzog, and I am going to change my time slot. I'm going to aim for a later time on Tuesdays, and I'm thinking around 4 or 5 o'clock, kind of like what time it is now. So let me know what you think about that. I don't know what I'm going to talk about next week yet. Haven't decided. So if you have questions that you want me to address on the show. Dude, I need a boyfriend. No, I've got an awesome husband. I'm all good in that department. Don't you worry about that. Let me know what you want me to educate you on in terms of space. There are going to be some more launches coming up soon. And thanks again to my patrons for the new sound setup. I hope it sounded good. And I'll see you later. All right? Okay. Bye.